Hi everyone. Welcome to today's live Q&A session with MD Consultants. My name is Choi. I'm a fourth-year AMD candidate at Stanford, and I'll be an incoming general surgery resident here as well. So the topic of today's discussion is U.S. medical school applications, and I'll go ahead and answer a list of questions compiled from students, and I'll also offer some advice I got as a Canadian as well. So I'll go ahead and start answering some questions I already got, but if you have any questions for me during the course of this session, I'll be going on until 6:30 Eastern Standard Time. Please feel free to type them in the comment box below, and I'll try to get to them as many as possible. So let me just pull up the list of questions here. And for those of you just joining us again, I'm Jeff, a fourth-year student at Stanford, here to answer questions you may have about U.S. medical admissions. And feel free to enter any comments that you have in the comment box below here, and I'll go ahead and answer them as we go along. So going through some of the questions that I've already gotten, I'll read out the question first. So the first question asks, what is your education background, and what were the factors of consideration that motivated you to pursue a degree outside your home country? So I grew up in Canada most of junior high and high school, but I did study in the U.S. for about a year or two during high school, so I had a bit of an idea what the U.S. education system was like. So as I was finishing up high school, I applied to both U.S. and Canadian colleges, and felt that the kind of career trajectory I had and the experiences I wanted to have would be best met by a particular university. So I ended up choosing to attend Cornell University. And after about 4 years at Cornell, there came a time when I was trying to decide where to go for medical school, where to go back to Canada or in the U.S. And after 4 years of doing college in the States, I just felt that I already had connections in the U.S. I felt I had a better understanding of what the U.S. healthcare system was like, what the U.S. medical application process was like, more so than the Canadian counterpart. So that's why I decided to apply only to the United States for medical school. Now, of course, there were kind of challenges I had to consider. Many of my friends from back in high school were staying local for both college and medical school, so they already had a pretty strong social network of friends and family, which I didn't if I were to stay in the U.S. for medical school. But I felt pretty comfortable that I would meet a lot of good friends once I start medical school, which I did. And it's not as easy not being with family, but still workable. So I didn't really have any hesitations about kind of not having enough kind of social support to be away from home for medical school. Second question that someone asked was, what are the main anxieties or challenges I experienced while applying to U.S. medical school as a Canadian applicant, and how I dealt with these changes? So I think one obvious challenge is that I believe in general U.S. colleges cost a lot more than Canadian medical schools. The average tuition cost, if you're from out of state, if you're a non-U.S. citizen, is anywhere from $40,000 to $50,000, and that's for tuition alone. And then you have to pay for housing and other expenses. So on average, your average expenses for medical school in the U.S. can add up to about $70,000 easily. And if you're an American citizen, there's a lot of federal loans you can apply to. Most medical schools also offer institutional loans. However, that is not the case if you are a Canadian or another international student. So, for example, you can't apply to U.S. federal loans, and at most U.S. medical schools, they will not provide institutional loans either. There are, however, certain schools that offer institutional financial aid to non-U.S. citizens. The list that I'm aware of includes Harvard, Yale, Pittsburgh, Stanford, And I'm sure there are other schools as well. You would just need to go on their website and ask their admissions offices directly. Now, even if on their website they don't mention anything about institutional financial aid available to international medical students, that's something that you can call and ask about to the financial aid office. And even at Stanford, when I first started, there was no institutional financial aid, but there were a couple of us international medical students. So what we did was we went ahead and talked with the financial aid office and made our case. And by my second year, we were able to get financial aid for international students as well. So it's not an option that's completely out the door if you do require financial aid as an international student. For Canadians specifically, there are also several loan options available. So one is the Canadian Loan Program that offers loans that don't accrue interest, and you don't need to pay back principal until after you graduate from medical school. But there's also provincial loans that you can get, and depending on the province, some offer loans that you don't even need to pay back interest or principal until after you graduate from residency, which is a really great deal that you won't get anywhere in the United States. So there are, if finances are a concern that you have for U.S. medical schools, yes, tuition does tend to cost a lot more than Canadian schools, but there are loans and other financial aid programs that are available to you. So again, I will go ahead and check the websites for the particular programs that you're interested in. And if there's no mention of institutional loans for international students, go ahead and contact the financial aid office too. You should probably qualify for a Canadian government loan, interest-free until after you graduate medical school, and then also some provinces do offer provincial loans that you can consider as well. So say that was the one of the big challenges applying to U.S. medical schools as a Canadian applicant. The second, of course, is for a lot of schools, you will be held to a higher standard compared to your U.S. peers, and it's understandable. And I think the average statistic is that you want to have about 2 points higher on the MCATs and 0.1 or so higher on the GPA. There's a study done earlier on that. So if you're applying to a U.S. medical school, let's say your average accepted American student to a particular program has a 3.7 GPA and a 35 MCAT, and as a non-U.S. citizen, then you want to have a 0.1 higher on the GPA and then about 2 points higher on the MCAT. So that's a general benchmark that you probably will be held to higher screening standards. But I don't think that should hold you back from applying to U.S. medical schools, because you don't know whether you'll get in or not unless you apply. And your GPA and MCAT score definitely are screening tools, but it's not the end-all, be-all. At a lot of medical schools in the U.S., they consider heavily kind of your potential and as a future physician, as a future physician leader, and kind of what kind of activities you did, what kind of passions that you showed through your activities all throughout your undergraduate years as well. So your GPA and MCAT, if they're not optimal, it shouldn't be the end of the story for you for applying to U.S. medical schools. However, do keep in mind that you do want to be held to a higher standard in terms of the numbers that you want to have before considering U.S. medical schools. So finances and the GPA and MCAT cutoff would be the two biggest challenges I think non-U.S. medical students would face when applying to U.S. medical schools. Now, someone else asked, if I could go back to my application cycle, what is one thing I would do differently? And before I answer that question, I think there was one advice which I really liked that I think did help me out a lot, and which is about a year or two before my application due date, I had a very strategic timeline lined about everything, about all the list of programs that I was going to apply to, when the due dates were, what material I was going to submit to each program, because I didn't take any gap years, so applying to U.S. medical schools in the middle of college is pretty stressful. So you want to make sure you have a good timeline laid out about when everything's due. You want to give yourself a couple months to write your essays and everything. So make sure you have a good timeline set about what kind of materials you need to submit to what schools by what deadline. One thing I think I would have done differently is try to get a better understanding of what all the different schools are like. So I think I applied to about 20 or so schools, and I didn't realize until after the interview process that although many schools are similar in terms of the educational experiences they provide, there are quite a few differences, I think, between a lot of the schools, and it's really hard to get at them from just looking at their websites, reading on blogs. Really the best way to gauge what the medical student experience is like is if you know a medical student already there. So I've done this, and I know people who've done this, so sometimes people just go ahead on Facebook, search the group for the medical school that they're interested in, and call the message someone in the school. And it doesn't work all the time, but I think it's very useful to have an insider's perspective about what the experience is like. Another thing which I didn't realize until now I'm about to graduate from medical school is how different, where you go for residency, a lot of times it's going to depend on what medical school you went to. And I don't mean that just in the sense of if you went to a top U.S. medical school, you'll end up at a top medical residency in the U.S. It's not just that. Certain medical schools tend to send students from their school to certain programs in the country. So for example, I'm at Stanford, and we tend to match very well to Stanford and Harvard, but not so well to UCSF for some reason, which is another top medical school in the area. So if you have an idea about what specialty you want to go into and then what part of the country, if it's in the U.S., that you want to practice in, then what I think would be a good idea is to go ahead and look at the match list for all the medical schools. So all the U.S. medical schools publicize their match lists on their websites. So I would go ahead and take a look at what specialties people matched into and at what particular programs. And let's say if you really want to practice, if you really want to do residency in California, but the particular school you're looking at hasn't matched anyone to California in the past few years, chances are, for whatever reason, graduates at that school either choose not to or have difficulty matching into California for residency. So looking at the match list for different schools is something that I do recommend. So another question someone asked is, I'm hesitant to study abroad when I'm away from my family and friends. How do you build your support network and de-stress in a new environment, especially when there are so many stressors already from a rigorous curriculum? So it is true, like I mentioned earlier, being away from friends and family is difficult, but you'll make new friends if you go to medical school, unless you've grown up in the same town and unless you plan to stay there the rest of your life. Sometime you're going to have to move, and I think medical school is a great opportunity to go ahead and meet people from lots of different backgrounds. I think meeting new friends just exposes you to so many different cultures, so many different ideas. So I think not just as a medical student, but just as a person, I've grown a lot more from being exposed to a whole new set of friends over here at Stanford. And, they've provided tremendous support for me when I go through tough times at school. So, regardless of where you go, I wouldn't fear so much about leaving home because most of the students will be on the same boat with you. Most people in U.S. medical schools are away from family. They live in dorms or around school with other friends, and you'll have a pretty strong support network wherever you end up in the U.S. So let's see. Someone asked, what are... let's see, let me go ahead to this question first. Studying at a U.S. medical school is not very appealing to me. Given a choice, I would always choose a Canadian school. Should I even bother applying to U.S. schools? It's a very good question. However, if for whatever reason you've already set in mind that studying at a U.S. medical school is not very appealing to me, if you've already set the mind, not really much to change that. But I think in terms of application, I think you can definitely boost your chances of getting into a medical school if you apply to both Canadian and U.S. medical schools. Understand that the application process is a little bit different, the forms are a little different. You'll probably have to write a couple more essays, etc. but there tend to be a lot more programs in the U.S. that you could apply to because there are just more medical schools in the U.S. compared to Canada. So, I think it's worth, if you have some time, I think it's worth applying to both U.S. and Canadian medical schools. Number one, it will boost your chances of getting into a medical school if that's a concern you have. And number two, I think you'll be surprised to find there may be schools in the U.S. that are a great fit for you that you wouldn't have realized otherwise. So Rodrigo asked the question, what major differences are there in transitioning from undergrad to medical school? And I think biggest transition is in terms of the amount of work that you have to do. So I wouldn't say the material that you learn in medical school is any tougher than the material in undergrad. If anything, I felt the material I learned in medical school was a little easier than what I learned in undergrad. But the sheer amount of material that you have to absorb in a short amount of time, it's something that you probably won't have experienced in undergrad. And the way you transition to handle a more difficult, a larger workload is just being more efficient with your time management skills. So, I try not to waste a minute of my day. It doesn't mean I didn't have fun. I still have fun in the evenings and on weekends. But, during the school week especially, I made sure that I was efficient in studying. So I figured out the best studying methods to absorb the most amount of time of material in the least amount of time necessary. So just learning to be efficient in your studying is probably the biggest transition point that you have to go from undergrad to medical school. The other thing is that at most medical schools, they won't be as on about you about getting work done. So, for example, a lot of your college classes, they may have taken attendance, or they may have had TAs who look out for you all the time. But in medical school, I think a lot of medical schools, the mentality is that you'll get exactly what you sow. So if you don't put in the work, no one's going to be there to hold your hand. You'll kind of wake up one day and realize that, wow, you're really not cut out for this. So you really have to be, you're the only person who can be on yourself to get all the work done for medical school. And I think that's not a difficult transition to make if you understand that, to really become a good physician for your patients, which hopefully is the reason you want to go to medical school, then it's pretty easy to be motivated enough to study hard, make sure you learn everything that you're supposed to without anyone telling you that you're supposed to learn these things. So, I think two biggest transition points for undergrad to medical school, again, one is in terms of the sheer amount of work that you have to absorb. That just kind of comes with time management. And number two is being really self-motivated to get your work done and do the learning without anyone telling you what you need to do. Now, another question someone asked was, I was an unsuccessful applicant for Canadian schools last cycle, so I'm planning to apply to U.S. schools as well this year. When you experience failure, what helps you think positively about yourself and bring back your confidence? So thanks for sharing that. I think it's definitely difficult to go through a failure, especially if you were hoping to have your chance to become a physician and you weren't successful at getting U.S. or Canadian medical school admissions. One thing I would remember is that you don't always get everything on your first try. Nothing ever really turns out the way you expect them to. So I think it's important to first understand that you will fail many times in your life, and I wouldn't consider this a failure. I would probably consider this more of a delay. So I would just look back and try to figure out, if I was unsuccessful in something, I try to look back and figure out why I was unsuccessful. I try to divide into categories. Is this something that I can change, or is this something that I can't? If the failure was due to something I can't change, then there's really not that much to do about it. So I try not to think about it. But if there is something that I can change about it, which is usually the case for many failures, then I go back and try to correct things. So let's say that your GPA was poor or your MCAT was poor, so you were probably screened out from a lot of schools. Then, one thing you can consider is taking post-bac classes to boost your GPA. Do a master's if you have to show that you have academic competence. Retake the MCAT to show that you have the academic competence to stay in the academic rigors of medical school. So those are some of the ways that I would address kind of failures that you have had in the past. Now, Joshua asked this question: does U.S. medical schools require professors from courses you've taken and community references? However, Canadian universities don't have pre-med committees. How do you approach your professors and deans, many of which you haven't spent a lot of time with, to obtain these letters? So very good questions. So like Josh mentioned, for U.S. medical schools, there's you want to submit about 3 to 4 letters of recommendations from, usually at least 2 from science faculty and then 1 from non-science faculty, and also a community letter. So there's actually a blog post I wrote in MD Consultants addressing this in detail. So you can go ahead and check the MD Consultants website, and if you go to blogs, there's a couple of blog posts about U.S. medical school admissions where I go answer this in detail. But to keep things short, number one, understand that most people are in the same situation as you, where they've taken a science class with 100 other students and they haven't really had personal interactions with the faculty. Maybe you got an A in that class, but so has a couple dozen other people. So how do you really stand out? Number one, understand that you don't necessarily have to stand out to get a good letter. I think a lot of faculty understand that many science students want to consider medical school, or be it in the U.S. or Canada, and they require certain letters. And they've written these letters for many students in the past, so I would just go ahead and approach them with a list of things that you would like them to write about you. So for example, just give them your resume, give them your personal statements, so really be prepared. So don't just go up and ask someone that you haven't met about for a letter, because they won't be able to write a strong letter. So literally what I did was I wrote a list of things that they would like to mention for me in the letter. So such things as, these are the strengths I have. From science faculty, you want to show that you have the scientific aptitude to undergo medical training. So you show that, I received an A or a high B in this class. And this is what I learned in this class. This is some of the research that I've done. As a medical profession, I think I have the scientific rigor, I have the discipline, et cetera, et cetera. Just give them a list of what you want them to write about you, and that just makes their life so much easier. And unless you give them blatant lie to lie about, they'll usually go ahead and write it for you. So I think that's a pretty good approach to approach professors. You don't necessarily know very well to get letters from them. Now, going to another question people asked, specifically about Stanford. Someone asked, what is one opportunity you gained at Stanford as a medical student that you would not be able to experience at other medical schools? And I think specifically for Stanford, the kind of inside motto we have is that we want to become great physicians and something else. So every one of us, our goal is to become the best physician we can be for our patients in whatever specialty that we choose. But Stanford also requires you to, quote-unquote, major in something else. So my major was in community health. That tied in very well with my background studying public policy as an undergrad. But also, because they give you a lot of freedom to become a leader in your field, I was able to partake in cool experiences. Like I led a healthcare consulting club as a senior partner. So I consulted Stanford Hospital on real issues, operational issues that Stanford Hospital has, and we provide them real solutions, like any other company, like McKinsey or Boston Consulting Group would do. So I thought that was a really cool experience. In terms of the research opportunities that we have at Stanford, it's one of the biggest research academic centers. So literally any research ideas you can think of, you'll find a world expert in it. And so I was able to do cutting-edge research that isn't available at most academic centers in the world, and I was able to kind of lead that research as a first or second year medical student. So I thought that was a great experience to have at Stanford, and probably one that you would have at any of the major academic research centers in the U.S. or Canada, for that matter. Now, a couple more questions about U.S. medical admissions and what happens after going to a U.S. medical school. So people ask, after residency, do I plan on practicing in the U.S.? What are your motivations for practicing medicine outside of your home country? So for those of us who are just joining us, so I will be doing general surgery residency here at Stanford, and I think for me personally, I do plan to stay in the U.S. At least for the foreseeable future, and there isn't any particular reason. So I don't know the Canadian medical education or healthcare system as well as I do in the U.S. medical system, but because I went to undergrad in medical school and now residency in the U.S., I think it just makes more sense for me to stay where I already have a pretty strong professional network. But I think there are people who choose to leave the U.S. after medical school. So there are people who choose to either go to Canada for residency or even fellowship. Canada has really strong residency and fellowship programs, and I don't think going to U.S. medical school bars you from those opportunities. Both U.S. and Canadian programs are licensed by the LCME, so U.S. MD counts as much as Canadian MD. I think you may need to take a separate licensing exam, but it's one exam that you need to take. But I think in terms of if you want to go back to Canada after U.S. medical school, I don't think that option is a difficult one to achieve for you. And someone asked, let's see, in regards to matching residency in Canada after doing U.S. medical school, would I be treated as an international applicant? So kind of to flip that, in the U.S., it's, I think, partially true. So even if you went to a U.S. medical school as a non-U.S. citizen, I don't believe you're considered as a U.S., the same as a U.S. citizen from a U.S. medical school. However, you're also not considered an international medical graduate. For that matter, if you went to Canadian or U.S. medical school, you're not technically considered what we commonly refer to as an IMG, which is a very tough pull for U.S. residencies. I'd say you're probably in the middle between IMGs and then U.S. citizen or permanent resident graduates from U.S. medical school. But again, I think that's an issue that there really isn't much to do about. Just understand that when it comes to applying for residency in the U.S., yes, just like it's probably a little tougher for you to get into some U.S. medical schools as a non-U.S. citizen, it may be slightly tougher for you to get into U.S. residency as a non-U.S. citizen, but it's not impossible. And I don't think concerns about the future should really hold you back from applying to U.S. medical school. Now the question is it difficult to match the other way in residency in Canada from a U.S. medical school? I personally don't have experience applying to Canadian residency, so I don't know if U.S. graduates are at a disadvantage compared to Canadian graduates. However, my feeling is that if you went to a comparable program in the United States, you should probably be held to the same standards as a Canadian. Especially if you're a Canadian citizen, I don't believe you'll have any difficulties from passing the screening process, at least. Now, there's probably different licensing requirements that you do have to meet, but I don't think any of these are too difficult barriers to overcome. Another question someone asked is, what is one piece of advice you would like to pass on to students wishing to pursue medicine in the U.S.? So this is summarizing a couple of the points that we've already discussed today. One is a lot of people are concerned with finances, arguably so, agreeably so, because it is very expensive to study in the United States. With tuition and housing, you're looking at probably $70,000, $80,000 a year in the U.S. But understand that some programs have institutional financial aid available, even to non-U.S. citizens. Canadian government has loans available, and also the provincial governments. Most provincial governments do have loans available, so those are options that you can look into for financing. And there's also one thing I didn't mention is that if you're interested in primary care specifically, and there are programs where if you agree to, after residency, practice in a underserved area in the U.S., they have certain loan forgiveness programs. So that's another option to look into funding your medical school education in the U.S. if you're interested in primary care. The other advice I would have is, I think there's really very little to lose from applying to the United States for medical school. Again, I think most of the programs are comparable in caliber to the education experience you would have in a Canadian medical school. I think it just opens up more doors in terms of the fact that there's just so many more medical schools in the U.S. that you can apply to compared to if you were to apply just to Canada, thereby just increasing your chances of getting into a medical school if that's your number one goal. And also, I think it's throughout your interview process, you'll just meet more people. You'll meet more future physicians. I still meet, during my residency interviews, I met people I was on medical school interviews with during my residency interviews. So, I think the world of medicine is a pretty tightly knit field, and the more people you meet, the better it is for you, especially if you're considering a career in academia in the future. So, number one advice is, don't hold yourself back from applying to U.S. medical schools for certain concerns that you have. And again, I have a blog post up on the MD Consultants website for top tips for non-U.S. citizens applying to U.S. medical schools. So if you have particular questions, I would first go ahead and check out that blog post. It will probably answer a lot of your questions that you have. And if you have additional questions, MD Consultants would be happy to address your questions, so feel free to email us at info@mdconsultants.ca or send us a message on Facebook. And we'll be happy to answer any specific questions that you have about applying to U.S. medical schools. Now, I believe our time is up, unfortunately. So if there's any additional questions that you have, again, feel free to send us an email or a Facebook message, and we'll go ahead and answer those questions for you. All right. If there are no more questions coming out live, then we'll go ahead and end our session here. All right. Thank you.